maybe someone had reneged on a drug payment, and this was a retribution, vengeance for people not paying for drugs they had ordered.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't hear. That my mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear the thoughts build up until I can't hear. That my mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. This is a critique of Howard Blum's definitive theories. Just come out with a book published by HarperCollins, and in the book he writes, quote, "I have been able to interview many individuals with direct knowledge of the murders. Now, standing here on King Road, I finally believe I know what happened and why." In Howard Blum's recently published book, he claims to have come up with the definitive narrative on what happened to the Idaho 4. Has he? Has he succeeded? Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. If you're finding this analysis worthwhile, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. So this analysis will be a critical analysis of what we'll refer to as Blum's theory. Now, I want to cut to the chase and deal with two aspects in his theory that I'm not sure about. That's kind of a kind way of saying I disagree. And so these are his words from the excerpt published on Mail Online. I'll put a link to that in the description. Blum writes, quote, "Back on the third floor on November 13, the killer opened Mogan's bedroom door and he found Maddie Mogan. Her bedroom door, that's on the uppermost bedroom, and he found two girls asleep in the bed, according to a source familiar with the case that prosecutors presented to a grand jury." Now, I'm not sure why it's necessary to say that, because it's in the affidavit, so you don't need a source familiar to the case. But anyway, let's not nitpick. Now, while it's true that the killer was likely surprised to find two people in Maddie's room, I'm not sure that both of them were asleep, actually. What do you think? Do you think that he came up there, opened the door, and they were both sound asleep? Because that's what he writes. The killer opened Mogan's door and found two girls asleep in the bed. Do you think that's true? And so in his scenario, he basically has the killer surprise attack Maddie, and then all hell breaks loose, basically. So now I'm going to take you to the affidavit. As I say, you don't need to talk about some kind of a source familiar to the case. You can just go to the affidavit, and that deals with this aspect. And I'm going to read it verbatim. DM, that's one of the other roommates, stated that she originally went to sleep in her bedroom on the southeast side of the second floor, that is directly under Maddie's bedroom. DM stated she was awoken at about 4 a.m. by what she said sounded like Kaylee Gonzalez playing with her dog. So the sound she heard sounded like it involved a dog in one of the upstairs bedrooms. A short time later, DM said she heard who she thought was Kaylee say something to the effect of, "There's someone here." So a short time passes, and then she hears talking. A review of records obtained from a forensic download of Kernodle's phone showed this could have been Kernodle, as her cellular phone indicated she was likely awake and using TikTok at about 4:12 a.m. Now, obviously within the affidavit, there's a sense that the investigators possibly disagree with DM, thinking that maybe she's misinterpreted what she heard, and what she heard instead was said by Xana, right? Anyway, from a witness at the scene, it sounds like the dog was barking, or at least awake sometime during the incident. A security camera also picked up the sound of a dog barking throughout the incident. Now, I'm still dealing with the affidavit. We'll go back to what Blum says. At approximately 4:17 a.m., a security camera located at 1112 King Road, a residence immediately to the northwest of 1122 King Road, picked up distorted audio of what sounded like voices or a whimper, followed by a loud thud. A dog can be heard barking numerous times, starting at 4:17 a.m. The security camera is less than 50 feet from the west wall of Knodl's bedroom. Now, also, walking up the wooden stairs would likely be heard as well, kind of a clomp, clomp, clomp going up the stairs, creaking, not only by the girls, but by the dog as well, by Murphy, Kaylee's dog. So I think it's a stretch to imagine that by the time the killer actually made it inside the room, he was so stealthy that nobody woke up. So up until this point in his scenario, Blum has left out an important character, Murphy, Kaylee's dog. And Murphy probably did the job of waking up the whole household, perhaps fairly early on in terms of the incident. Now, this is going back to Blum's version of events. Blum writes, quote, Koberger would have no way of knowing that Kaylee Gonzalez, who had a separate room on the third floor, would be sleeping in Mogan's room. That's Maddie Mogan's room. The girls were especially close, and Gonzalez had just returned home after an extended trip away. Okay, end quote. Still no mention of the dog. Now, if Koberger didn't expect Kaylee to be there, well, he likely didn't expect Murphy either. And I think Murphy is part of this crime scene. Certainly the noises that were made and the disturbance that resulted. Anyway, back to Blum, he writes, quote, I suspect that Koberger first slashed swiftly, savagely at Mogan before turning his blade on Gonzalez, end quote. Now, just because Maddie was his target, and I'm not saying Maddie wasn't, but just because Maddie was his target doesn't mean when he opened the door, he started slashing Maddie at first. In my opinion, the answer to this question, who was his first victim, is likely whichever victim was found closest to the door, whichever victim he encountered, whoever was closest to him. I really don't think if Maddie was on the other side of Kaylee that he would have kind of stepped around Kaylee. But even this doesn't mean during the assault positions were changed or weren't changed, and the victims ended up somewhere in the room to where they'd started in the beginning. Without seeing the crime scene photos, it's quite hard to speculate. One scenario that Blum's scenario is that Maddie was stabbed first, presumably in her sleep, and another is that Kaylee was already awake, conscious that her dog was alerting or barking, and saw the killer coming. It could also just be that one of them woke up hearing footsteps out the door or even just hearing the door open. She put up a fight. That's Kaylee put up a fight. Hence, she suffered some of the most and worst defensive wounds. And it could be while Kaylee was fighting off her killer that Maddie was too. While Kaylee was fighting off her killer, Maddie was sort of also trying to pull him away. And perhaps that's how and when and why she pulled off the knife sheath. It also makes no sense if Maddie was stabbed first, while asleep, while lying down, that the knife sheath was found under her. So I would say,
I think you missed that.
But what do I agree with? I do agree that the killer likely targeted Maddie and that his intention was to kill her and only her. Kaylee being there was something he didn't expect, and rather than the slick, stealthy serial killing everyone seemed to think this was, it was actually an unmitigated disaster, waking virtually everyone up and being seen by a witness on his way out. He actually ran out of his own crime scene. I don't think he left at a time that suited him. I don't think he left voluntarily. I think he left because he was basically panicking and he's running out of time and things were exploding around him. Blum goes on to write, after this initial encounter at the Mad Greek, I suspect that Koberger continued to follow Mogan and at some point obsession turned into murderous intent. Now, that's quite interesting what he's saying there. He's saying, I think obsession turned into murderous intent. That's a little bit different to what he said about 9 months ago.
According to the defense, there is no connection whatsoever between Brian Koberger and the victims. And if there is no connection, then there is no motive. And if there is no motive, then it becomes very hard to make the case that he is the killer.
So I'm not really sure what he's doing. Is he saying what he believes is the case? Is he saying what the defense case is? Is he kind of playing both sides? Is he saying that's the defense theory, but it's not my theory? I'm not quite sure what it is. But in any event, in his book, he talks about this is the murderous intent. On the 48 Hours documentary, seems to be saying that there's no motive and then thus there's no case. And something about it's open and shut and it's going to fall apart. Then he goes on to write, whenever 1122 King Road hosted a party, as they often did, he may have been watching from the shadows. Now, none of this is rocket science, of course, but I would say the general thrust is in the right direction. But I think it's important to remember that the general thrust at one point seemed to be way off. I think it's important to be clear about how Blum's theory has evolved over time. Now, on the 28th of January 2023, Blum reported on the quote-unquote bad facts of the case, seemingly supporting the defense case against Koberger and minimizing the validity, for example, of touch DNA. And we actually see him on camera on a TikTok snippet saying the case against Koberger is essentially full of holes.
Bad facts. What are bad facts? Well, that's a term, a pejorative term, that lawyers use to impugn the evidence that's being piled against their client.
And then he goes on to say, he talks about what these bad facts are, and seemingly he seems to be supporting the defense case at this point. This is January 2023 against Koberger, minimizing the validity of touch DNA. So as I say, we see him on camera on TikTok basically saying that the case against Koberger is full of holes.
The evidence that's being mounted against him, at least as it's been shared with the public at this point, has a lot of holes in it. It's not a slam dunk item. There's the DNA on the knife sheath. The DNA that's on the snap of the knife that was found at the murder scene, well, it's touch DNA. And that's a whole world of difference from blood DNA.
And if you want the full context to that TikTok video, I'll put a link to that in the description. You can check it out yourselves. But the point is that in that time and when he was writing about that, he was basically seemed to be questioning the validity of touch DNA and also the supporting, in a way, the defense case against Koberger. That's how I understand it. Now in his book, he seems to imagine Koberger is the killer and the DNA supports his case. So one has the impression, I did, that Blum initially didn't put any stock into Koberger's culpability as a potential suspect, or he doubted it to some extent. That appears to have changed, and unless I've misunderstood, that appears to have changed. You know, what does he say? I'm standing here in front of the house and I finally understand, or think I understand, what has happened. Well, kudos to him for getting himself on track. But I would say, it's just my opinion, the mark of a good, intuitive, detail-oriented investigator is being able to intuit the reality early on with minimal information. So, you know, if early on you thought Koberger wasn't a good suspect, or perhaps you think that now, I would say I don't think you're a terribly good investigator. If early on you thought, I wonder if Koberger is a serial killer because of the nature of this crime, I would have also said, I don't see it that way. Look at how things have turned out. Blum also makes the claim that his book is definitive. Now, it may well be. I haven't read it, but he makes the claim that it's definitive. It's not really up to an author to decide whether his account is definitive. It's up to others to decide. It's also depends on just how factual it is, accurate it is, well-reasoned it is, sensible it is. And so obviously for an account to be definitive, I mean, sometimes you have definitive accounts that actually aren't definitive or shouldn't be definitive. There are a couple of definitive books in the Ramsey case that I don't think are definitive. But in any event, it also needs to be other things. It needs to be reliable. It needs to be credible, and it needs to be consistent. You might think it's reliable, but it might not be. You might think the author is credible, but he may not be. You may think he's been consistent in his theories, also he may not be. Now, with a few reservations here and there, I do think Blum has done well with his current version, and I like how he starts off, and I'll deal with that in a second. I also like how he has spent quite a lot of time working on this. Obviously, anyone who spends a lot of time focused on one case is going to dredge up these insights, is going to find their way to the finish line. Anyway, this is the part that I like. He writes, I'm standing at 1122 King Road in Moscow, Idaho, staring at the vacant lot where the murder house once stood. The drab, grey, 3-story home was demolished in December on orders from the University of Idaho on the belief that its destruction would exorcise the demons still swirling in this tiny college town after November 13, 2022. It hasn't, meaning the demons haven't left. Now, I actually visited the house myself, and that was before it was demolished, but when it was boarded up. And that was my original argument for not demolishing the house, which is even demolishing it, even getting rid of it, isn't actually going to get rid of the memory of it. And here you have that confirmed. Changing it, right? Changing the house. And there you're using architectural techniques and a little bit of psychology, making an effort to deal with the psychology collectively, confronting it is how you deal with it. Not dealing with it is not the right way to deal with it. Anyway, he goes on to write, 19 months after 4 college students, and then he names them, were butchered to death with a hunting knife, there is still no convincing official explanation of what really happened. That's kind of another way of saying no one has written a book about this. No one has come up with a fully fledged narrative about this, but I have, and check it out, look how good it is, kind of thing. And I think there is another narrative out there. When he says official explanation, maybe he means by official a police explanation or a explanation from the court, let's say a legal explanation. I do think there are a bunch of unofficial explanations, and I'd like to think mine is one of them. I think I would also venture to say mine was one of the first explanations that made sense even before we knew the suspect was or what the details were. Anyway, he goes on to write, I began reporting on this case in the days immediately after the killings. I've spent weeks in Idaho and even crossed America to the small Pennsylvania town where Koberger was born and raised. Now, that is how a writer or storyteller becomes credible. That is what I've been trying to do myself when I've been in America, visiting all sorts of places. And certainly it is the meat and potatoes behind any effort to be definitive. It was actually my plan to go to that Pennsylvania town when I was in America a couple of weeks ago. But there were, unfortunately, a couple of problems. I got ill and other things as well. Anyway, I was actually invited by someone to visit Pennsylvania, and I just didn't get round to going there. In any event, he goes on to write, Brian Koberger, I believe, then made his way down the dirt incline, mindful of the thin coating of frost on the ground. And this is something that is quite valuable in terms of not only a narrative, but also trying to visualize what is actually taking place here. It's important that one does try to do this as kind of intimately as one can. And that is what he does here. Then he writes, in his gloved hand, I imagine him gripping a leather sheath that looks like a K-bar knife with its 7-inch steel blade. Now, one thing we don't know is the leather sheath attached to his belt or is he just carrying it in his hand? It's quite skillfully written that this part is actually left out. But one way or another, I think that is something we need to know. He goes on to write, the students in 1122 rarely locked the sliding glass door to their kitchen. So this is his theory on how the killer gained access. I do think it does make sense. November 13, 2022 was reportedly no exception. The panel would have effortlessly glided open. Koberger could have easily, almost silently stepped inside. Once in the kitchen, it is my understanding that he proceeded up a narrow staircase to the 3rd floor where the first killings occurred. And it is this fact that suggests to me that these murders weren't aimless, that there was intent.
According to the defense, there is no connection whatsoever between Brian Koberger and the victims. And if there is no connection, then there is no motive. And if there is no motive, then it becomes very hard to make the case that he is.
That was 9 months ago, and so I don't really know whether he's saying that's just what the defense think. I don't think that, or whether he's saying, or whether he meant to say that's what the defense think, and I think they've got a point. I don't know, one would probably have to ask him that. But anyway, he then goes on, obviously this is probably his latest and current version of what he thinks happened. He seems quite explicit about that. He says, Koberger had a plan, which means he had intent. And I believe it was to target Maddie Mogan and her alone. True. I agree with that. But that's not what he was saying 9 months ago. And this is basically the second point I feel Blum got completely wrong early on. He participated in a documentary, I think it was 48 Hours, and he said on camera, as you heard, if there's no motive, there's no crime, and there's no connection to Maddie. And of course, he goes on to describe the connection, which many of us thought about, and right, and of course, it's not a absolutely carved in stone connection. It's possibly they met at the Mad Greek restaurant, right? What I said at the time was, if you can't see a motive, it doesn't mean there isn't one. It means you can't see the motive. And it seems Blum has fathomed one now, or certainly since that interview. He goes on to write, Koberger most likely first crossed paths with Mogan at the Mad Greek restaurant on Main Street in Moscow. Yes, and this is me speaking, that is quite likely. He goes on to write, the restaurant was the only one in town to serve the sort of vegan dishes that Koberger's relatives told me he preferred. It was also where Mogan worked as a waitress. Now, you could go all the way to Pennsylvania and interview his relatives, or you could have, I don't know, read a bit about him, and you could have found that out very early on. And he goes, and all of that is true, that he did prefer vegan dishes, and Maddie did work there as a waitress, and it was one of the few restaurants in Moscow to serve these sorts of dishes. And I think it does suggest Koberger had more in common and likely more of a connection with Maddie than Kaylee. I don't know if you can say that it's indisputable. It's also possible that he encountered Kaylee somewhere. Perhaps Kaylee was visiting Maddie, or perhaps came across her on social media in some way or some other way. Anyway, he goes on to write, did they talk? Did he ask her out? The prosecution and defense have agreed that there is no evidence of any interaction, either in person or on social media. So there's no evidence. And so again, does that mean there's no case? Then he says, but I believe that wouldn't have been necessary for Koberger to become infatuated with 21-year-old Mogan's pretty face, long blonde hair, and sparkling personality. Well, yeah, it's also something that's not rocket science. Many of us thought this pretty early on. Of course, Kaylee's family seemed to be very attached to the idea that their daughter was the target, because I think Kaylee was worried about someone following her. Is there any link in terms of that aspect? And then Blum basically kind of summarizes his position in terms of this connection. He describes Koberger saying obsessions came easily to him. He was, after all, a recovering heroin addict. Absolutely. Well done. You've keyed into such an important aspect, his identity. But you really need to be doing that at the beginning, not at the end. This is a good inference. The diet and many other things and the kind of person that Koberger was. But it's a good inference, but knowing a bit about the suspect is something you need to start. You start off your research with that aspect, right? You don't do it at the end or, a little bit later in the game. But anyway, knowing about the suspect is how you do begin to discern. Certainly this aspect is obsessive, compulsive, and yes, addictive personality. One thing he is right about is the case against Koberger, I don't think is open and shut, but I also don't think it's nearly as dubious as many are making it out to be. Anyway, that is my assessment. Let me know what you think about it in the comments. I'm just saying what I think. I'm not trying to be mean. I'm not trying to be nitpicky. It's simply looking at another person's version of what they think happened, and I'm providing my critical analysis of it. So that's what it is. Let me know what you think. Let me know if you agree or not. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.